When two university students move into a supposed haunted house together, unexplained events begin to pull the two further and further apart until their friendship is in complete disarray. Now, with that said, I am your host, Uriah Baker, and welcome to Tales of the Clockwork. The home on the corner of 3rd and Allcroft was far from perfect, but for 19-year-old university student Thomas Mueller and 20-year-old Walter Purcell, it was everything they needed and more. The friends were looking for a place to stay off campus, but being university students, they didn't really have a whole lot of extra money. And one of the reasons that this home was perfect for them is it was selling for extremely cheap. According to some rumors, the house on the corner of Allcroft was haunted, and this property had previously been purchased and sold 7 times just in the last 5 years. The reason that people saw this property as being haunted is, one, people had some strange experiences there, but also, a little over 100 years ago, the land that this home was built on used to be used by a group called the Cult of Sobek. In Egyptian mythology, Sobek was the god of rivers, warfare, and fertility, and often depicted as a crocodile. Now, in Egyptian mythology, there were many different deities that were associated with fertility, but Sobek was one that was specifically worshipped when talking about the fertility of people who were barren or could no longer have children. Elders in this cult would lure women who were barren to join with the promise that Sobek would bless them with children. But it wasn't just devotion to this cult that was required in order for Sobek to bless them. Being part of this cult meant taking part in their rituals, and part of the rituals for members of the cult of Sobek was sacrifice. A human sacrifice. The cult would abduct women that they called the Chosen, dress them in these long white dresses, and they would prepare them to be sacrificed. The elders would wear these long robes with hoods that sort of had this top portion jutting out of their foreheads so they could look like a crocodile. The chosen women would then be sacrificed, and the members of the cult that were barren would then eat the remains of those sacrificed, believing that Sobek would accept this sacrifice and then bless them with children. Now, despite knowing the rumors of this house being haunted, when Thomas and Walter heard that the house was for sale, they didn't care. In fact, they didn't even tour the home before putting in their offer, and within 2 weeks, they were moving in. This was a 3-level home that had a bedroom and sort of an attic space that had been renovated, a main floor, and then a small basement. Thomas decided to stay in the room in the upstairs attic, while Walter moved into the bedroom that was on the main floor. When they first walked in, everything seemed pretty normal in the house, and they were especially excited because the previous owners had left a lot of furniture and didn't bring a whole lot of things with them when they moved out. As they walked through the house, Walter continually would be making these jokes about how the house was haunted, and at one point he even pulled down the curtains and put them in front of his head and said, "Give your life to Sobek," before taking it off and laughing about it. Over the next several weeks, everything in the home was completely normal, but it wasn't long before that would start to change. One night, Thomas was home alone while Walter was out with some of his friends, and he was in the main living area on the first floor with some headphones on listening to the radio when all of a sudden he got this really uneasy feeling that someone was watching him. He took off his headphones, sort of looked around the room, but he didn't see anything, but he just couldn't shake this feeling that he was being watched, and the hairs on his arms started to stand up, and he knew something just wasn't right. All of a sudden, he started to hear this really faint, high-pitched pinging sound. And he wasn't totally sure if he had heard it at first, so he sort of leaned forward, listened closely, and then he heard it again, this high-pitched pinging sound. The sound caught his attention, but he couldn't really connect it to anything and couldn't really place what he thought the sound was from. But he stood up very quickly and began scanning the room because he just couldn't shake this feeling of dread. He was about to take a step forward to go investigate somewhere else in the house, but that's when the whispers started. From different sides of the room, he started hearing these whispers, and the volume of them was pretty low and he couldn't make out if they were saying anything coherent, but he began frantically looking around the room to see where he could hear this sound coming from, and that high-pitched pinging sound is still continuing in like this rhythmic pattern almost, and it's starting to feel like this entire room is just spinning around him with all of these sounds, and he has like a sensory overload moment where he just covers his ears, closes his eyes, and sits back down on the couch. And as he's sitting there with his ears covered and his eyes closed, he hears a knock on his door. When he uncovered his ears, the whispers and pinging sound had completely stopped. And again, the knock went on the door, and this time he heard who was yelling from outside. He ran over to the door, opened it up, and saw Walter standing outside. Walter walked past Thomas and kind of joked and said, "Hey, took you long enough." And he sort of laughed it off and followed in with two of his other friends that were with him. And despite being totally freaked out about what Thomas had just experienced, he didn't even bother to bring it up to Walter. A few days later, in the middle of the night, Thomas's eyes shot open as he woke up in his bed. He didn't know why, but again, he just had this really intense feeling of dread and uneasiness just wash over him as if he was being watched yet again. And that's when he started to hear that very faint pinging sound start to play over and over again. He stayed in his bed completely still as his eyes were sort of looking from left to right, trying to figure out if there was something in the room or if he could see anything at all that might indicate where this sound was coming from. When he couldn't identify anything in the room, he sort of held his breath and listened really closely. And that's when he could hear these creaking sounds as if someone was walking up his stairs. He didn't really want to move because he didn't want to make any sound that might alert whoever this was that was coming up the stairs that he was in the room. As he laid there, he could literally feel his heart pounding in his chest as his heart rate increased. He held his breath again to try to get a better listen, but the booming sound in his chest was all he was able to hear. He tried to calm himself down, and when he did, he could hear the creaks getting closer and closer until they were all the way at the top of the staircase, and he was certain that someone was right on the other side of his door. Thomas just laid there staring at his door, waiting for it to open, but it never did. The next morning, when Thomas went downstairs, Walter looked at him and said, "You look terrible. Did you not sleep well last night or something?" And Thomas tells him, "No, I didn't sleep well," and asked Walter if he had been awake last night and moving around the house. But Walter told him that he had been asleep all night in his room. That's when Thomas explained the sounds that he had heard the night before with the creaks and coming up the stairs and his uneasiness that he was being watched. Now, Walter just sort of made light of the situation. He made his typical jokes about the house being haunted, but when he sees that Thomas isn't really laughing at this and he seems really shaken up, Walter becomes a little bit more empathetic, tells him that the house is just old, it makes sounds, and he's sure that everything is fine because he didn't hear anything at all last night. A few weeks later, Thomas was returning home late because he and a friend were out at a nearby diner studying for an exam. Because they were getting back so late, the friend asked if he could just stay at Thomas's place for the night, and Thomas said that was fine. As the two of them approached the home, they saw that a light was on in the upper level. Now, this struck Thomas as a little bit odd because his bedroom was the only room on the second floor. The two of them stood outside the house looking up into that window when all of a sudden this dark, shadowy figure sort of steps forward and they can see his outline in the curtains. The figure is very tall and has this large, narrow shadow jutting out from the top of its forehead. And before Thomas can say anything, he looks over at his friend, who is now sprinting down the road. He knew about Thomas's experiences in this home and he didn't really think much of it, but just seeing this figure in the window was enough for him to be long gone and get out of there. By the time Thomas looked back up in the window, not only was the figure completely gone, but the lights were off in his room. Thomas is trying his best not to be freaking out about this, so he makes his way up to the door, goes inside the house, and makes his way upstairs to his room. He isn't really sure what he's expecting when he opens the door, so he takes a deep breath, opens the door, and to his surprise, nobody's there. He checked every corner of this room before sitting down on his bed when he noticed something sitting on his desk. His desk was normally spotless, which is why this thing just seemed so out of place, and when he took a closer look, he knew exactly what it was. According to stories about the cult of Sobek, in order to select a woman to be marked for sacrifice, the elders would flip a coin. On one side of the coin, it was marked with the symbol of Sobek, while the other side depicted the Nile River. If the coin landed on the Nile, the person was able to live. But if the coin landed on the side marked with Sobek, that person would then be chosen for sacrifice. When Thomas picked up this coin from his desk, side facing up was with the mark of Sobek. And as he was sitting there examining the coin, all of a sudden he registered what those high-pitched pinging sounds were that he had heard throughout the house. He flipped the coin into the air, and as he did, the coin made that high-pitched pinging sound. Immediately, Thomas went downstairs and he barged into Walter's room. Walter was sort of startled awake by the sound, and Thomas starts getting really aggressive with him. He shows him the coin and starts yelling about how Walter had just taken things completely too far and it wasn't even funny anymore. Walter was completely confused and said that he didn't have a clue what Thomas was talking about. So Thomas goes through the list. He tells him about the whispers, he tells him about the pinging sound from the coin, he tells him about the creaks in the staircase, he tells him about everything he has experienced since they moved in. And afterwards, he accuses Walter of being responsible for all of it. To Thomas, this was the only thing that made logical sense. According to Walter, he never had any of these odd experiences since they moved in, and very conveniently, every time Thomas had these experiences, Walter was just in the right place at the right time to stage them. He and his friends were outside the house when he heard the whispers, Walter was home the first time he heard the creaks coming up the stairs, and Walter was home right now when they saw the figure in the window. But Walter didn't admit to anything. Over the next several months, Thomas continued to have strange experiences in this home at night. He would hear tapping on the walls, creaks on the stairs, and that faint pinging sound still ringing throughout the house. It was during these months that Thomas and Walter had completely stopped talking to each other, and they had basically cut each other out of their lives. They both lived in the same house, but they didn't communicate at all about anything and actively avoided each other when they were both home. About 5 months after moving in, Thomas had reached a breaking point and had had enough. He barely slept at night, he was constantly feeling like he was being watched, and even though he had a very logical explanation about what was happening, he felt like he wasn't safe in his own home. So he decided that the next time he hears these creaks or footsteps or tapping or the pinging sound, he was going to catch Walter in the act. And just a few days later, that high-pitched pinging sound comes back, and so do the creaks on his staircase. Thomas quickly got out of bed and waited by the door. He sort of pushed his ear against the door so he could hear the creaks better to sort of know where this person was on the staircase. When he thought the person was relatively close, he closed his eyes, counted to 3, and then flung his own door open. And when it was open, he didn't see anyone there. And when he took a step forward and looked down the staircase, he still didn't see anyone. So he ran down these stairs as fast as he could, and when he did, he saw someone standing in his living room, and it was Walter. Thomas is livid, and he starts yelling at Walter, saying he knew that it was him this entire time, that he had taken this joke of the house being haunted way too far for way too long, but Walter doesn't respond. He is just staring straight forward. Thomas is getting really frustrating, goes up to him and pushes him, tells him, just admit it, admit that it was you this entire time and we can be over this. But instead of admitting anything, Walter just sort of lifts his arm and points towards the staircase to the basement and says, something just ran down the stairs. On one hand, he's happy that maybe Walter had finally experienced something in the house that he did, but on the other hand, if this is just Walter continuing this game, he's gonna be really upset about it. And even worse, if Walter is telling the truth and something did really just go down their stairs, the two of them have a much bigger problem that they now have to deal with. Walter starts moving for the stairs when Thomas stops him for a moment. Walter tells him, I'm going to prove to you that whatever this is, it isn't me. And Thomas is a little reluctant about this, but he agrees to investigate. They each go into the kitchen and they grab these huge rolling pins and they start making their way into the basement. Now the basement to this house isn't very big. It has sort of a main room and then one side room that's mainly for storage. When they get into the main room, they pause and they listen for any signs of movement, and that's when these whispers start coming from behind that side door. The two of them look at each other, they raise the rolling pins in the air, and they start to approach this door. As they do, the sounds of these whispers start getting louder and louder and more audible. Walter was the first one to grab the door handle, and he stood on the left side, while Thomas took position on the right side, ready to strike anything that was inside the room once the door was open. Walter counted to 3, opened the door, and when they did, the whispers immediately stopped. Thomas entered first with Walter right behind him, but neither of them saw anything. They looked around the room for a minute in complete silence to see if these sounds would start, but they never did. And as they were about to leave, Walter started to hear this scraping sound coming from behind a shelf in the corner. Walter tapped Thomas on the shoulder and then pointed over to the cabinet. The two of them went over to it and pulled back the cabinet, and when they looked down, they saw 2 legs from the knees down sticking out of their wall. They're a bit startled by this, but they don't care. They reach down, they grab these legs, and as they start to pull, a person slowly starts to emerge. Once the person was out, they rolled him over, and he saw Walter and Thomas standing over him with these massive rolling pins in the air, and he just surrendered. He put his hands in the air, but he didn't say anything. When officers spoke to this person, he would identify himself as Bennett Flax and as being homeless. When the detectives searched the area of the home that he was entering, they were shocked. Inside this little crawl space, there were 2 small mattresses, there was storage in there for clothing, there was food, and a ton of other supplies needed to survive. Not only was there enough stuff to live in there, but there were tunnels that ran through this entire house that went through the walls, into the attic behind Thomas's room, and they went everywhere. Bennett told them that when he was getting back into the tunnel, he was going too quickly and his body got wedged in one of the small gaps and he just couldn't fit through. When they asked Bennett about the second mattress that was in the crawl space, he just refused to talk. But it only took a couple days later, when they were searching through the tunnels of the home, that they found another person that would identify herself as Adelaide Mercer, who was living with Bennett in this crawl space. These two had been living in there, moving through the walls, into the attic, under the basement, for the last 6 years, watching and terrorizing these different homeowners. When questioned why they did it, all Bennett said was that the people living in the house were so scared and had so much mental anxiety in knowing the history of the home and what was going on that they never noticed any food was missing. Both Thomas and Walter still live in the home and they have repaired their friendship, and as of now, Bennett and Adelaide are currently awaiting trial.